Ed Stadium. We're sitting here with Bill Newsom tonight in his mountain home in Dutch Flat, California, reminiscing about the late, great James Martin MacInnis, one of the most flamboyant, colorful, interesting San Francisco trial lawyers in a long chain of interesting characters, going back perhaps to Jake Ehrlich, Vincent Hallinan, MacInnis himself in the present era, Tony Serra perhaps. We thought it was fun to reminisce over some of the great courtroom exploits of MacInnis. He was able to do things in the court that none of us would dare try, or if we did, we'd certainly be cited for contempt and fined and pay a heavy price for trying to do what he did naturally, and everybody loved it. So let us turn to Bill and ask him if he recalls some of these stories. Bill, of course, knew him better than anyone. Practiced law with him for a while, and over the years observed him closely and was able to develop an almost perfect mimicry of the unique voice and carriage and bearing courtroom manner of James Martin MacInnis. Now, Bill, one of the stories I remember best, I think, has to do with the time when MacInnis got down on the floor and in the middle of the argument of the opposing counsel.
That's true, a true story. I wasn't there, but it occurred in the courtroom of a friendly judge who didn't mind MacInnis's antics at all, and it was involved a prosecution with Walter Giubini as the assistant DA on the other side of the case, and MacInnis got very angry and disappointed with Giubini, and so all of a sudden he knelt down on the floor and he keeled over in Judge Leo Cunningham's court. And Judge Cunningham said, "What in the world are you doing on the floor, Mr. MacInnis?" And MacInnis looked up and said, "Your Honor, I'm trying to get as low as this prosecutor."
And also, wasn't there a great story about the divorce action involving Les Vogel, the Chevrolet automobile mogul?
Yes, there was, and it requires me to engage in some crudities.
Well, we'll forgive it.
Thanks. MacInnis was representing the wife of Les Vogel, the Chevrolet king of San Francisco, Vogel Chevrolet. And during the course of the trial, in those days, I must add that it was possible to have investigators and to get into details. The era of no-fault divorce was not upon us yet. And so MacInnis was cross-examining Les Vogel, and I remember that he asked Vogel a couple of searching questions, like, "Mr. Vogel, do you remember where you were on the night of August 3rd of 1961, whenever it was?" And Vogel felt the heat coming on. He was in a very bad position that night, and in a motel someplace. And so he answered lamely, and he got angrier and became incensed with MacInnis. And when he sat down after being cross-examined, he said something to MacInnis. He stood up and walked across the room and said, "Jim," he knew Jim MacInnis pretty well, and he said, "Jim," he said, "you prick." And Jim got up and said, "Mr. Vogel," he had never met Vogel, "did you address that expletive to me?" Incredulous, feigning incredulity. And of course, Vogel said, "I never said a word." And so MacInnis got up and looked at the judge whose name I can't now recall, but he lowered his head. Judge Capiccioli it was, Walter Capiccioli, and he said, "Your Honor, it appears to me that Mr. Vogel must have called Your Honor a prick." And so anyhow, Capiccioli told me that he just dumbstruck, ran off the bench and hurled himself into the chambers and collapsed in paroxysms of laughter. And was a great example of how MacInnis could do things that nobody else could get away with it.
What about the time he recited Latin in the courtroom?
A famous occasion for me. I was working as a law clerk for Judge Joseph Karish on Law in Motion. We had a wonderful, distinguished assemblage of fabulous lawyers who were all assembled as flies might have been on a carcass or something, because they all were being paid enormous amounts of money in a case where all the principals had been dead for many, many years. And so the losers would win, but the winners would win big time. And everybody was in a very jolly mood for that reason. And so a lawyer from Pillsbury, Madison, Sutro was very ebullient and very pompous. And he said to Judge Karish, "Your Honor, I know that the meanings of the terms per stirpes and per capita are very important in this case. And I make some small claim to the knowledge of the Latin language, having been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. And so I'd like to address myself to that." And all of a sudden, MacInnis came up like a whale come out of the water and said, "Your Honor, may I be permitted some brief interruption here?" And the judge said, "Go right ahead, Mr. MacInnis." And MacInnis turned to Turner McBain and said, "Co usque tandem abutere, McBain, paciencia nostra." And the reporter, brilliantly, as on cue, said, "What was that? What did you say?" And MacInnis said, "Mr. Reporter, you may take that as follows. How long, O McBain, will you abuse our patience? And I may add the court's patience." And McBain clicked his heels and bowed slightly and said, "Very impressive, Mr. MacInnis." And MacInnis turned to him and said, "Turner, a mere snippet of high school Latin." That was MacInnis in action. It was very, very good.
Bill, thank you.
Thanks.